I'd like to introduce Kristina Haverkamp, who is the Managing Director for the German Energy Agency. She'll be giving her lecture on the realistic targets for the EU's Green Deal in 2021 amid COVID-19. Kristina, I'll hand it off to you.
Well, thanks a lot, Brian, first of all, for having me. As you know, the German Energy Agency has the objective to support the German government in energy transition and to, let's say, communicate the good news inside of outside and outside of Germany. So I'm very happy to be able to seize this opportunity to talk a bit about what the European Union has done and must do. I think that's the more important part, even to make climate change mitigation reality, while at the same time fighting the problems, economic and social problems resulting from COVID-19. The most important thing that happened last year was that the heads of state and government in December finally decided that we will raise our ambitions in terms of climate protection. We will be pursuing a target of minus 55% greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, as opposed to 40 before. And we want to become the first climate neutral continent by 2050. Now, this is a huge step as opposed to what we have before. We have already notified these targets as our national determined contributions to the UNFCCC. So we are bound also globally in this regard. And the challenge now is how to make it happen. And the most important step last year in that direction already was a consensus on the budget of the European Union, comprising more than 1 trillion euro for 2021 to 2027, plus a recovery, and that's important, a recovery and resilience plan, which comprises another 750 billion euro. And it is clear from the decisions of the heads of state and government that this money shall go into climate protection at least by 30%. So that will make more than 500 billion, that's important, support from the EU budget for climate protection in the member states. However, it is not clear yet in the detail how the money will be spent. And this will need to be decided very soon now. The chefs have decided that they don't want to put all the money into specific climate protection schemes, which makes sense. What they want is basically a mainstreaming of climate protection in everything the European Union does, meaning that now we will need to devise regulations on the common agricultural policy, on the cohesion policy, on the research, development and innovation policy of the European Union, which each provide that they will contribute to climate protection by at least 30%. That's very important, and that will be done in the next couple of months. Another step that needs to be taken is the member states, which will be the recipients of the recovery and resilient money. They need to draw up recovery and resilience plans in which they specify how they will spend that money. And this will be approved by the Council of the European Union and by the European Commission, assessed. So they will need to look very closely at how they are going to channel the money into climate protection, because it is required to do that. These plans will need to be submitted in late spring, and I expect them to be passed in the summertime. Now, this is the financial part on the union level. But the European Commission has calculated that if we raise our ambition from minus 40%, which we had before, to minus 55% in 2030, we will need to spend in Europe an additional 350 billion euro per year to reach that new ambition, additional. And that, of course, means a part, less than a third, can come from the EU budget. The rest must be coming from the member states and must be coming from private investments. And in order to reach that, you need to adapt the regulatory framework, because it is, well, for member states, yes, they will, of course, pledge additional money for the goals, but the private sector is unlikely to do that unless you give them regulatory incentives. And that means that in the next couple of months, the Commission will submit reviews of all our energy and climate protection policy regulation. The most important part of that is, of course, the emission trading system that right now in the European Union provides for a rather robust CO2 price that has been very helpful in reducing emissions, both in the energy sector and in the sector of energy-intensive industries. But that does not cover building and transportation, both of which are very problematic in terms of climate protection. So what is going to happen certainly is, first of all, there will be further updating of the ETS as we know it, tighter cap, stronger reduction. But at the same time, we will have a very interesting discussion as to whether or not to include transport and building. And it's not as easy as it sounds, because the abatement costs in transportation in particular for the car industry, they're extremely high. So they would be willing probably to pay a high CO2 price, which would give the price a push that might push it through the floor, or the roof rather, not the floor, and make it incompatible with our industrial policy, because industry would then, if it's a common market for CO2, industry would need to pay that too, and that would be a problem for competitivity. So we will need to discuss that. And it's going to be a very interesting discussion. Then, of course, we will review the Energy Efficiency Directive, Renewable Energy Directive, Energy Performance and Buildings Directive, product legislation, all these kind of things which are relevant for the emission of CO2 within the European Union, raise the ambitions in order to reach minus 54%. Right now, the design is such that we could expect minus 45% by 2030. So there is a gap to be covered. And this also will not be an easy discussion, in particular, looking, for example, at buildings. There's also always a social component. Who is going to pay for that? Who can afford it? What does it mean for rents, for lesser income population, things like that. So also a very interesting discussion to come. Then maybe the last aspect I want to mention right now is, of course, the European Union needs to protect its competitiveness. It is clear that we are, or we want to be at the front in terms of climate protection. But that only makes sense when we can maintain our industrial bases. If industry moves to where the rules are less strict, nothing serves it's not good for climate protection. So this is why the heads of state and government have called on the European Commission to propose carbon border adjustment mechanism that and that must be compatible with the WTO regulation. So that's not going to be easy. A mechanism that ensures that goods that go into the European Union carry a financial burden for climate protection that reflects what needs to be done and is more or less equal to our protection level. I expect that to be the first proposals to come also in the course of this year. And I'm sure that we will need to get into good faith discussions with our most important trading partners to see how we can implement that while maintaining friendly relations. Well, that much as a short run through. I'm very open to questions.
Thanks, Kristina. And of course, for those who are joining us right now, feel free to ask any questions in the chat, and we'll try to answer as many as we can before we close out the session. I just wanted to start with an overall question. You mentioned, the competitiveness aspect. Of course, a big part of that is driving the cohesion as well to enhance that competitiveness. As you know, across the EU, different countries are starting at different positions for their transition to climate neutrality. How do you see mitigating their differences while at the same time propelling progress for each country?
Yes, indeed, that is a balance that must be struck. Supporting countries that are starting from a difficult position in going into the middle playing field without at the same time leaving them the liberty to drop out of the joint possibility. The European Union has provided for a Just Transition Fund, which will support regions that are subject to, in particular, transitional challenges in connection with coal phasing out in the European Union. This Just Transition Fund will have a volume of a bit more than 7 billion euro, and it will be dispensed to regions on the basis of development plans. Now that will cover social aspects, training of workers, for example. It will cover entrepreneurship, support for the startup of businesses and for small and medium-sized businesses, but it should also be used. The expectation has been voiced rather clearly. It should also be used for things like renewable energy and energy efficiency in these regions. Apart, there is a second fund, the so-called modernization fund, which will be fed from the from profits coming from auctioning ETS licenses. 2% of the cap shall be auctioned and channeled to the 10 poorest member states. So this is not for the regions, but it's for the member states, supporting, and it's of course mostly new member states, supporting their changes in the energy system and also in energy efficiency, for example, in buildings.
And just touching on the ETS, I think we have a question here in the chat box. Do you see the EU ETS as a springboard of trial and error for helping Europe lead the charge with establishing a global price on carbon, or are they two different worlds?
I'm not exactly sure whether I have understood that question, I'm afraid. Trial and error, yes, we have had that, of course. We have had a carbon price of 3 to 5 euros for ages, and it did not serve the climate at all. We have learned a lot in the past, I would say maybe 10 years, updating the ETS practically every other year, looking closer at the cap, at the reduction factor, taking licenses out of the market when it's flooded with the stability mechanism. And I think now it is a very sound system, which indeed we could market worldwide. I think we could go around and show how we are doing it. And of course, other countries, including, by the way, China most recently, are introducing emission trading systems. So our very much our hope is that in the end, we will end up with a worldwide, globally accepted system based on our ideas, but certainly not copying it one-to-one. That would be too much to expect. I hope
Thanks.
that answered your
Nope.
question.
I think that clarified everything. Just a follow-up question as well to earlier. Part of the EU Green Deal is an action plan to promote a more circular economy. Which steps do you think should be taken in 2021 to build a better foundation for this concept and for this initiative?
The European Commission has published an EU Circular Economy Action Plan last year, which is very ambitious and which points out a large number of activities that should be undertaken this or next year. I must say the concept is at the same time extremely important because it will certainly help us to reduce our dependence on rare materials, which is becoming more and more of a challenge, in particular in view of investments having been made by other large states and continents in the recent past. It will also be, of course, very good for the climate because the less you extract and the less you dispose of, the less emissions you have. And we also think that it will be good for the economy because it will give rise to a lot of new business models in this area. However, it will be necessary to, let's say, take the quick wins first. I think, for example, the eco-design regulation, which focuses on the technicalities of day-to-day products, is a very important instrument to introduce slowly, step-by-step, product-by-product changes that can be done without too much of a challenge. Then there are other questions, such as, in particular, the right to repair, rules on obsolescence, which I personally find extremely interesting. But that will certainly require intensive discussions with large players such as Apple and others. So I don't think we'll get there by this year, probably. And then there are, again, areas such as building, for example, where we basically know what we should do, but it needs to be done in a technically sound manner that can be implemented by private players, by private companies that are not very knowledgeable in these things. So we need to prepare that in a sound way, technically.
Well, thanks, Kristina. We're just coming up on time here to wrap up, but I just wanted to again give it back to you for any closing comments that you would like to make on the year ahead. Any top 3 points that we may not have touched on.
Well, as for the European Union, I think one very important question that will be coming will become even more pressing in the year to come is how do we deal with gas as a fossil fuel necessary for the transition, but not wanted by 2050. I'm talking about fossil methane, of course. And I wonder how we are going to get out of that. This is a look at the internal challenges, looking at the external, of course, the European Union understanding itself as a forerunner would be very, very happy if it would be followed by other member states, including not only the United Arab Emirates, but all countries in the world. And my appeal would be to look closer at what can be done. There's a lot more possible than one might think from far away.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much, Kristina, for your insights today.